Welcome to this webinar on transition. It is November 2015. The aims of this webinar are to share the transition workshops more widely. In September and October, we delivered a number of workshops across the country for local authorities and parents about the transition process. These were very successful, and we felt it was important to share the learning from that more widely. And what do we want to cover? Well, we want to take a short while to look at what we've actually learned from the challenges of year one, a very demanding year, but what have we learned that will help us with our future tackling of this task? We also want to use this to support local authorities with strategic planning for the transfer of statements and LDAs, what needs to be done, by whom and how. And finally, the department issued amended guidance on the transition process in August this year. What are the particular implications of this amended guidance? So let's start by looking briefly at the feedback from year one. A very demanding year, new tasks, new reforms. What did we learn about the transition process? We got a lot of feedback from parents. We got it through parent-carer forums, through various parental groups we meet. Local authorities have been collecting individual feedback from parents. So we get quite a big profile of feedback from parents. And there were a number of positives that they expressed, as well as some concerns. Amongst the positives, they do like the focus on strengths and outcomes, both in terms of the written plan and in terms of the dialogue in meetings, that people are thinking about the future, the outcomes, and talking about the good things that are going well. They're feeling more empowered, they're feeling central to the discussions. Person-centered planning does seem to be the experience for many. A number report happiness with the format and the content of the education, health and care plans. And for many, they're also saying that plans are proving to be better than statements. They reflect the whole child. On the concern side, many have felt frustration over the length of time between the initial meeting, the person-centered meeting where they have felt empowered, they felt that people have been listening to them, they felt a focus on outcomes. And then there's been almost silence. And they have found frustration with the length of time between a meeting and further information, receiving a draft or a final plan. A number have reported that they don't fully understand the process, and we need to listen to that in terms of our communication. And for parents, as well as many others we know, there have been a number of issues with understanding how the new post-16 system operates. Local authorities have provided us with a lot of feedback in terms of the challenges they have faced. And there's no doubt that capacity has been an issue. The number of staff to do the size of the job has not been sufficient. And many authorities have taken a while, inevitably through the recruitment process, to come up to full strength in relation to the additional resources that the department has provided. So many teams didn't have the full team in place until much later in the year. They've also found challenges in getting quality and timely advice from other agencies, and schools and health have been particularly an issue. And generally meeting the timescales has been quite a challenge. Despite their best efforts, the size of the task, the capacity in the teams has been quite a challenge. And a number of local authorities have made some changes to the transition plans they published back in September 2014. Indeed, over half, 56% of local authorities made some changes. The reasons for the changes varied, but inevitably a number of authorities had to reduce the aspiring high numbers of transfers to reflect what they found out about the size of the task and the need to build their capacity. So they reduced the numbers. As we've already said, recruiting additional time took longer than expected to recruit. But many places say they're now in place and confident of making good progress this year. And a lot of people learned that to do the transfer plans in the spirit of the Act and be person-centred and get new reports that when they were needed, these could not be done at the rate that people had first expected. Partners, we've already heard, are not providing the sufficient advice in time. And a number of authorities provided updated advice, sometimes several times, to schools and others on how to conduct the transfer review. So it does seem a lot of learning went on. There were plans made to transition plans. We also heard from individual parents the following types of feedback. My feelings are this is a vast improvement on the statement, takes account of everything about your child. So don't be worried or scared when your child's review comes. You will be pleasantly surprised and come away feeling positive. And it would be nice to think that that could be the experience of the overwhelming majority across the country. Having everyone to contribute was effective and positive. And a school found that it had been overwhelmingly positive in terms of strengthening partnership, but also in terms of clarifying aspirations. And again, of course, clarifying aspirations, being more explicit about aspirations, is a very important part of the new agenda. So that's some of the feedback we've collected nationally in terms of the transfer process. So just for a moment or two, how does this reflect your own experience in your authority? Would you say that your views as an authority and those of your parents echo what we're hearing nationally? How do you know? What evidence do you have about how you're doing? Just a moment to reflect. We're now going to take some time to look at the transfer review process itself. There have been one or two small changes, mostly to the timing, for all those reviews being conducted from September 15. So we just want to have a quick look at the who, the how, and the by when. And the first thing to emphasise is we are now working from amended guidance from the department. So you all need to make sure that you're referring to the third edition, September 2015. There's the web link. Make sure that your published transition plan has a reference to this link. So just in general terms, planning the transfers, as a basic principle, what we're saying is that local authorities should aim to make the new arrangements for all children and young people as quickly as they can. So a general principle that people need to undertake this task as quickly as is feasible. But the bottom line is that all statements must be converted by the 1st of September 2018. And for those with an LDA who are continuing in FE or training beyond the 1st of September 2016, if they need an education, health and care plan, they should have one by the 1st of September 2016. All local authorities have published a transition plan. That was initially published in September 2014. That needs a progress report attached to it annually. So a progress report that describes progress, how many have been completed, any changes in your planning, and who's coming next. And then at the back of that guidance, there is an appendix, and that spells out quite clearly the requirements and expectations relating to different groups of children and young people. So do turn to that, have a look and check that you know which groups you need to transfer and by when. We've had a couple of questions sent through on this specific issue.
If the child is moving from infant to junior, do we have to do a transition review?
As a general principle, anyone who is likely to move from one institution to another, from one school to another during the year with a statement must have a transition review during that year. So yes, if a child is moving from an infant school to a formal junior school, then yes, there must be a transition review.
When must our Year 6s be finished by?
Again, a very good question. Year 6s who are transferring from a primary school to either a secondary school or possibly a special school, but someone who is at the end of their primary education, they must be subject to a transition review, and that must be completed by the 15th of February 2016. For those in special schools, all age special schools, so all through special schools, we would generally expect the transfer review to be completed by the end of the academic year. Let's look at some of the definitions around the process. So in the guidance, all of these terms appear several times. So what is the transfer review? Well, the transfer review is the whole period of the transfer process, from when we notify parents to the time when we issue them or the young person with a final education, health and care plan, the transfer review. Notification is a formal communication from the local authority to the family that the process will be undertaken, and it provides a start date. So it is a formal notification. It must be from the local authority, not from a school or other provider. The transfer review process itself is the period that begins from the above date, the date in the notification letter. So if you send a letter on the 1st of September that says we will start the process, the transfer review process, in at least 2 weeks' time, and you provide a date which might be the 1st of November, the period of the transfer review process is actually the 1st of November, not the date of the notification letter. Another definition, another term that's used, is transfer review meeting. This is the meeting that is formally held as part of the transfer review process. Usually it's in a school or a college, but not exclusively so. And again, some of the changes we've made are around the timescales, but they only apply to statements, and they only apply to transfer reviews that were started from the 1st of September. So there are two key timescales that we need to note. The first is the notification period. The local authority must provide a minimum of 2 weeks' notice of the date of the start of the transfer review process. So you may write on the 1st of December, "Dear parent, we the local authority are proposing to start your child's transfer review process, say on the 1st of January or the 1st of February. That is the notification period. You are providing at least 2 weeks' notice of when you are starting the process. And then the transfer review process itself is the period of the assessment with a maximum of 18 weeks from that start date, which might have been, say, the 1st of January or the 15th of January or the 1st of February, but that is the start of the date. So 2 periods of timescales to note. And again, we've had a couple of questions sent in on those issues.
What you seem to be saying is that the process can take more than 20 weeks. Is this actually the case?
Again, if you turn back to that previous slide, yes, the process can take more than 20 weeks. There are 2 distinct legal timescales. One is that a minimum of 2 weeks, so that is one element. So you give a minimum of 2 weeks. And then from the date that you start, you have a maximum of 18 weeks. So in total, yes, the process could take more than 20 weeks.
Can you send a pre-notification letter without any legal standing? This would include information about roughly when the transfer would start.
Indeed you can, and indeed that would be a good thing to do. It would be good practice to provide as much information as possible, as far ahead as possible. So there's nothing to stop you, say on the 1st of September, writing to all parents saying, describing the transfer review that is going to come along during the academic year and saying, we're going to be undertaking this transfer of your child's statement during the year. We will be writing to you probably around February with more information, and we will notify you of the formal timescales then. So you can provide early information. It's a good thing to do, and we would recommend it in terms of managing the whole task. We'll now turn to eligibility. Who is covered by the transition requirements? So eligibility in relation to the transfer of statements to education, health and care plans. Well, we need to remember that under the Children and Families Act 2014, the legal test of when a child requires an education, health and care plans is exactly the same as those that were applied to the requirements for a statement. So we would generally expect that children and young people who have a statement and who would have continued to have one under the old system will usually be transferred to an education, health and care plan. And the message we've been spelling out is that no child or young person should lose their statement and not have it replaced with an education, health and care plan simply because the SEN system is changing. The process of transfer to an education, health and care plan should not be a reason for ceasing a statement at the moment. And again, in terms of learning difficulty assessments, LDAs, to education, health and care plans, well, LDAs were initially issued for young people either because they'd had a statement at school, and that's the overwhelming majority of them, or because the local authority judged when they were 16, maybe 17 or 18, that they were likely to need additional support as part of their FE or training programme, and they would benefit from the provisions of a learning difficulty assessment. Then those were those young people who were issued with LDAs. Our expectation is that those young people who are currently receiving support as an LDA, in other words, because the local authority judged them to require an LDA at some point recently, and who remain in FE or training during the transition period, if they request and need an education, health and care plan, they will be issued with one. So there is an emphasis on them requesting an education, health and care plan. So a couple more questions we've had in relation to this area.
Do plans actually go up to 25?
Well, the new reforms cover 0 to 25. The Code of Practice describes quite clearly the circumstances when a young person would require an education, health and care plan beyond 16, 17, 18, or even more crucially 19, which is proving to be quite a challenge in terms of operationalising. Technically, plans can go up to 25, and that was the intention of the reforms. But they are only going up to 25 for an individual young person who continues to have education and or training outcomes that would benefit from further special educational provision that would be enabled by an education, health and care plan. We anticipate that there will be fewer as each year goes by fewer 25-year-olds than there were 19-year-olds with education, health and care plans.
How do you decide if someone with an LDA requires an EHCP?
Well, I think I touched on that in my last answer. Again, it is someone who has a continuing need for special educational provision to meet their education or training outcomes. It's not always easy to determine which are education and training outcomes, and it is dependent on good working relationships and good assessment across all three agencies. But the emphasis is on a continuing need that focuses on achieving education or training outcomes that have not yet been met. So there is a key there for local authorities through the assessment process to be very clear on outcomes, to make sure that they are smart, relevant, and relate to the young person's aspirations. Let's look at the actual process of the transfer reviews. So what must a local authority do? Well, we've already talked about giving at least 2 weeks' notice of the start of the transfer review process. That should be fairly straightforward. And the whole transfer review is, in effect, a full education, health and care needs assessment. That's what Part 5 of the Transitional and Saving Order 2014 describes. So it's really an EHC needs assessment. And everyone must have regard to the 2015 Code of Practice in undertaking assessment. They must follow the principles. There must be good listening to families, good engagement of young people and children, etc. And we must ensure that parents or the young person are invited to a meeting to contribute to the transfer review process before the plan is finalised. So all parents or young people must be invited to a meeting, at least one, with a local authority member of staff in advance of the plan being finalised. Of course, they don't have to take up the offer of a meeting, but it must be offered. And the transfer review meeting itself is part of the process. It's part of that 18 weeks. Where it's located in the 18 weeks depends on the purpose of the meeting, and that is important to plan well ahead. The aim of it is to consult or engage the parents or the young person. Local authorities need to decide who should be attending the meeting, and it could well take the form of an annual review meeting with a range of relevant professionals who are considering the progress of the child or the young person, the future provision that's required, and reaching agreement on future outcomes that need to be recorded. It could simply be a meeting between the local authority and the child's parents or the young person to discuss the draft plan, having had a lot of work going on at school or college level by others. And in terms of the type of advice that the transfer review requires, well, although we've said that it's an education, health and care needs assessment, we do want to emphasise that local authorities must not seek any advice for this process if we've already got advice that everyone agrees is sufficient. By what we mean by everyone, that includes the child's parent or the young person themselves, the professional who initially gave the advice, and the local authority. If all three parties agree that particular advice is sufficient, then there is no need, in fact, one must not seek new advice. There is a fine judgment, undoubtedly, as to how one decides whether existing advice is sufficient. So, factors that you will want to consider will be how recently advice was provided. So, how recent is it? There's no blanket way of deciding whether advice that was submitted 18 months ago is sufficient. For some it will be, for others it may not be. We'll also need to determine whether and how far the needs of the young person or child have changed since the original advice was given. And also, critical to the new agenda is whether it's sufficiently focused on outcomes. And there is going to be, I think, a challenge for much advice, which hasn't really had much of a focus on outcomes. And that's why I think there'll be quite a lot of new advice sought. The new advice may try just to focus on outcomes. So just in terms of your own thinking, this issue about whether to collect new advice, whether existing advice is sufficient, is obviously central to the efficiency of your transfer review process. Just have a few minutes to reflect. How do you or how will you manage that process of decision making? And also, allied to that, when will you make that decision? How will you make that decision? With whom and when? And we've got one question related to this specific issue.
Must the LA actually meet the family as part of the process? And if so, who from the LA must meet them?
Right, well actually I think that's two questions, if you don't mind me saying. The first question, must the local authority actually meet the family? The local authority must invite the family to meet with them. It doesn't mean that the meeting must take place if all parties think it's sufficient not to meet, but there must be the offer of a meeting. The second question, who from the local authority must meet them? Well, that again is not determined. It must be a local authority employee, and it must be someone who understands all about education, health and care plans, who can talk to families in meaningful ways about outcomes that might be in the draft education, health and care plan, may be able to talk about personal budgets, may be able to relate to all the services. It must be a local authority employee. Often it will be a coordinator, an EHC plan coordinator. It might be a team specifically charged with undertaking the transfer review processes. So there could be a variety of people who would be eligible, who would meet that criteria, but they must be a local authority employee. This task cannot be delegated to providers, for example. If we think about transfers of LDAs to education, health and care plans, well, local authorities must consider a request for an EHC needs assessment for a young person with an LDA. So you must consider the request. It is a formal legal process. If the request comes from someone who is not the young person, i.e. someone of statutory leaving age, which is 16, the assessment must only proceed with the young person's agreement. So you must check back with the young person. If their parent or someone else writes in on their behalf, you must go back to the young person and check that this is with their consent. And essentially, as with the full new entrance process, local authorities have got 6 weeks following a request to decide whether they must carry out an assessment. And there is 20 weeks from notifying the young person that you're carrying out an assessment, or from when the young person requests the assessment to issue the final plan where it's required. So pretty much the same process as for new entrants. I think we've got one question on this.
What do we do if a parent writes in asking for an EHC needs assessment for their 18-year-old child who has an LDA?
Yes, and we know that this is happening already. I think there's an inevitability about that. But what you must do is contact the young person and ask if they are in agreement with the request from their parent or from anyone else about the possibility of an EHC needs assessment. So you really must check, and it's important to keep a written record of your communication. It could be a telephone call to the young person, but you must keep a written record of that telephone call. Let's look at the local authorities transition plan just briefly. This is something that was published by all local authorities in September 2014. These are the types of issues that need to be covered in a transition plan. I won't go through them all, they're self-evident, but what I think is an area that needs strengthening in some areas is the details of the transfer review process itself. A number of published plans don't really spell out the actual process that you will be following in your own local authority, and there are likely to have been some changes from year one. You are expected to update the transition plan. You need to make sure that it does reference the latest guidance from the department, and you do need to provide progress report on how year one has gone and what changes it's led you to input. So just have a reflection. It's worth looking at what is your published transition plan. Does it actually cover all of those bullet points on the previous slide? And what are your plans to amend? How will you do that? Will you do that in consultation with others, particularly your local parent-carer forum? So let's just take a moment to summarize the key points around transfer reviews. Remember, critically, it is an EHC needs assessment. But you can use existing advice where it's agreed. Where existing advice is regarded by all three parties to be sufficient, then that's fine to use existing advice. For statements, the process in 2 sections is 20 weeks, and for LDAs, it's a maximum of 20 weeks. A really important point to remember is that the local authority is responsible for the transfer review from beginning to end. But colleges and schools play a key role in the whole process. It would not be possible for this to happen without a lot of support and cooperation and contribution from schools and colleges, and we certainly are grateful to some amazing efforts from those providers during year one. We need to keep that momentum going. Independent supporters are able to help families and young people with this particular process in the same way that they can with new entrants to the system. A young person has a right to ask for an assessment. A young person with an LDA has a right to ask for an assessment. And we need to complete the transfer of statements by April 2018, LDAs by September 2016. Not very long to go with LDAs. And of course, a big message: no child should lose out simply because the system is changing. So that's a useful slide that captures most of the important points around the transfer review process. And I see we've been sent a very critical question.
Which is most important, quality or timeliness?
This is a real challenge at the moment, trying to achieve both. And of course, both are equally important. We need to make sure the quality is right, that outcomes are well specified, that provision is clear, quantified, etc. The quality is important. And in our feedback from parents that we started with, they reflect, I think, a desire from parents for both. And timeliness is an issue. So leaders, managers need to make sure that you're aspiring to improve on both fronts. This cannot be an either or. It needs to be a process of gradual improvements on both sides so that we all end up producing quality and good EHC plans in a timely way. And finally, let's think about tracking transfers. We all need to know how we're doing. We need to make sure that we are monitoring and tracking progress carefully. Here we have our colleagues from Leeds Local Authority who have devised a very interesting way of tracking their transfers. In essence, across the walls of the Statutory Assessment Office, they've put long strips of blank smiley faces. And every time they have completed an education, health and care transfer, the plan coordinator goes up to the wall and colours in one of the smiley faces. And gradually throughout year one, the wall chart became much more colourful with lots and lots of smiley faces. And as you can see in the top of their board, it's led them to conclude that we are the best. Well done, Leeds. Who can disagree with that? And a second approach is one that is known as the Berry transfer tree. So again, colleagues in Berry have devised a way of lifting diagrams, pictures that are on a young person or child's education, health and care plan, cutting them up and putting them onto a tree. And I think there are a few trees across the Berry Statutory Assessment Office. So think about what you can do to celebrate success with a task that is extremely demanding, we know, and yet we're all making progress. So think about how you are tracking your transfers. And finally, when we ran the transition workshops in September and October, we were very grateful. In each region, one local authority presented their experiences of year one, how they'd tackled the task, the lessons they'd learned. Some of them weren't easy, but they bravely presented at our events, and they have useful experiences, and all of their presentations are now available. Here we have them. And they can be downloaded through this address. Well worth having a look at these presentations. And finally, if you have any further questions on transition, do please email our colleagues at MOT and we will respond as quickly as we can. Thank you very much.